Hello and welcome to the Urban Omnist once again. As I promised you last week, we are doing an interview this time with my meditation teacher, Ken Goldberg. He is, or rather was, an ordained monk, Buddhist monk in the Thai tradition. And in the Thai tradition, you can become a monk for a certain amount of time and then go back to your regular life, which makes Ken kind of unique and really interesting to talk to. So, Ken, how did you get into Buddhism?
So, as I always say, it was a tortured path, fraught with peril. But I'm in recovery, and I have been for several years. And I've been in recovery off and on since 1982. But this last go around, the last 9 years that I've been in recovery, I really decided, because of my age, I'm 63 now, I really wanted to put more emphasis on my spiritual recovery because I used to be a millionaire and I lost it all. And the combination of getting sober, getting off of drugs and alcohol, and losing a couple $1,000,000 really was a bottom for me. And there was no relief that I didn't have the tools. Even in 12-step recovery, I didn't have enough tools at the time. And so I embraced meditation, and eventually it became mindful meditation. And I met some monks, and the one who became my primary teacher, his name is Ajahn Sarayut. He's a Thai monk in Tucson, Arizona. And I studied with him pretty diligently for 2 years. When I say diligently, I mean 3-4 times a week. At times we were hiking, and we were meditating, and we were studying, or he wasn't studying, I was studying Buddhism. And so after a period of time, I decided to become a Buddhist. And here I am several years later. He also taught me to lead and teach mindful meditation. And I've been doing that for a little over 4 years now.
Wow. Now, monks are generally looked at as being extremely peaceful people, but from what I understand, you weren't always all that peaceful.
No. In fact, that was a real problem in getting myself ordained. The monks just weren't sure. There's more than one monk at the temple, but the abbot, Ajahn Sarayut, he was really uncertain that he could trust me in robes to not land up in a fist fight with somebody. His experience with me as a lay person didn't give him the confidence that I wouldn't go off and hit somebody. And I was a firearms instructor, a martial arts practitioner. I'm a trial lawyer, so fighting is a way of life for me, or was. Well, I've resigned from the practice of law. I'm not a firearms instructor at the moment, although I do help people from time to time. So it's been a checkered history, and I used to own nightclubs, and I've just been in so many messes. It really, for me to be here with you today, took such a significant transformation, such a shift in awareness. And I don't know that there's anything short of mindful meditation which could have brought about that kind of transformation.
And how long would you say that transformation took?
It's taking. It's taking as we speak.
A lifetime process.
There's been junctions. There's been moments of for lack of a better term, enlightenment means something specific in Buddhism, but it also means something in general conversation when we have an experience that tells us that, we've moved, we've shifted awareness. And I think I shared with you once that, when I was in the temple, in the monastery practicing, and I realized one day as I was meditating by myself and observing my thoughts, learning to observe my thoughts, I came to the recognition that I was really a very petty guy. And by that I mean that sitting and watching my thoughts, I was unceasingly creating resentments over any little thing. And then I was inflicting those resentments on the rest of the world because I'm righteously indignant. And in that moment, I realized that this is what I had been doing a good part of my life. And that because I always thought my thoughts were real, I would act on them. And I decided that day I no longer had to do that. that I could start writing a news story, and I didn't have to be a petty guy in a news story. You know, a day at a time, I could show up and be a better person. And I got up that day for meditation. I went and I sought out my teacher, and I had promised myself I would only say one thing to him. And by the way, putting in context, I was his lawyer as well as his novice. So I had been used to trying to counsel him. Well, that day I made a vow to myself. The only question or the exchange was going to be, is there anything I can do to help you? And leave it at that. And that's what I did the duration of the time that I was living in the monastery, was simply to try to be helpful, not in my way, not in what I thought was going to be helpful, but how did they feel they needed help? So they didn't need me to tell them how to run the temple, despite the fact that I was 10 years older, you know, I had a law degree and all these things. They didn't need my counsel.
Now, it's interesting that you came to that realization while meditating. I think a lot of people have the misunderstanding that meditation is about nothing, that it's about clearing your mind of anything. And it's really anything but, isn't it? It's really more about focus.
I was taught that the mind is going to function creating thoughts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sleep and wake, it doesn't matter. So I'm not going to meditate my way into thoughtlessness. What I am going to meditate into is recognizing and being present for those thoughts and being able to distinguish the ones that are wholesome and not wholesome. That's a really big deal in Buddhism. The Buddha really taught a couple of things that underlie the foundation of Buddhism. He taught to be present, and he taught to be moral or wholesome, and there's several other things, but acceptance is the other one. Those three things are critical to transformation in most people, and most people will skip that. You know, they'll go to the gym every day, but they can't sit for an hour or 20 minutes with their own thoughts. And I understand that because the mind almost, when I sit, I just watch. It's almost like the circus came to town and I didn't have to pay anything to see it. I sit there and one day while meditating, I have such a variety of thoughts. Some which seem very serious and persistent and really need my attention. And I'm sorry I didn't bring a pencil and paper to meditation with me. And other times, things that are so ludicrous. I'm like, why would I be thinking that? Why am I petting dolphins in Iowa while sitting in Arizona? How did I have a thought that somehow, what seed of thought came about that led me to think about dolphins, led me to think about Iowa, led me to think about petting the dolphins in Iowa? I've never petted a dolphin in Iowa. I doubt there's any dolphins to pet in Iowa. But the mind has no relationship to reality necessarily. Some of our thoughts do, but in large measure they don't. So, I don't know. I found that the mind not only doesn't stop, but that my activities really need to be directed at simply,
I can just chop
it
off the
became
end.
more interesting when I found out he was on TV. Yeah, so I don't remember what we were talking about.
Yeah,
That's what
sorry,
happens.
we
That's what happens
lost a
when you
minute,
age.
which I'm afraid we all are. You were talking about how you were able to follow things, the way that your mind made connections point by point while you're meditating.
So obviously thoughts happen. If they're going to happen all the time, as Ajahn Jeff, also known as Piku Tanisero, says, and he's a very high-ranking Anglo monk in the United States, he says, do not meditate for serenity. That's just false. Meditate for sanity. Because if you're not meditating, if you're not aware of this creation of thoughts that's constantly taking place and running your life, then he said it's like turning the keys of your car over to an insane person. He says it's just not prudent. And I've seen that. But I had never seen it until I was, 55 years of age. If I had a thought, it was my thought, and I thought, well, it's a good thought, because I thought it after all. How bad
So it
could
should
this
be,
thought
right?
be? Yeah, but it turns out that I'm really not a good thinker, necessarily. And there were a lot of thoughts I was having that were detrimental to my well-being. Same thing with feelings. Well, we're all going to feel sad. We're all going to feel happy. We're all going to experience this this array of feelings, this continuum. And most people are ruled by feelings, but Buddhism has taught me not to be any more ruled by a feeling than I am to be ruled by what I'm going to have for supper tonight. So when I begin to feel melancholy, I simply be present for it. I simply, experience it, accept it, and go, oh, I'm feeling melancholy. It's just like when we're meditating, we talk about breathing in, breathing out. All these things that occur, we're just mindful. We just make a mental notation of them. So if I feel bad, well, where I feel bad. Although this monk that I met with recently said, well, should people spend as much time trying not to feel good as they do trying not to feel bad? So I'm going to have to think about that one for a while.
Well, I think bringing up acceptance is really interesting. I often used to use this metaphor where someone has a job picking up carts in the parking lot. And he goes out into the parking lot and there's carts all over the place. And so he gathers them all up and he pushes them into the store. And then he turns around and there's more carts. And it frustrates him. And so he runs out and he gets the rest of the carts and he brings them in and he turns around, there's more and there's more and there's more. And ultimately what he finally has to do is come to the realization that the purpose isn't to pick all the carts up out of the parking lot. Once he accepts that there's always going to be carts in the parking lot and that his purpose is simply to pick them up, the mind shifts, and that seems to be in line with...
Yes. Yeah, I used to come home and, the floor is dirty in the kitchen. The floor is always dirty. I have a family of 4 and my 2 daughters, although they're growing up now, were not as grown. And so there was nobody really to pick up after themselves. And I would come home and I would run through this litany in my head of all the things that hadn't been done. And when is these things going to be done? And then I realized they'll get done when I do them. What am I waiting for?
Right.
And then the next step is, am I going to do them and resent that I'm doing them so that I'm hostile? Or am I going to do them because they need to be done and I want them done and just accept that that's the most expedient way to do it? These were levels that I had to come to because I spent a great deal of time, well, this needed to be done. Oh, and I'm mad that nobody else did it. And now I'm mad that I did it. And I want to know how we're going to do this so that I'm not in this position again. How are you people going to fix this? They weren't going to fix it. They weren't even interested in fixing it, by the way. My daughters, for example, have no interest in cleaning the house. They do sometimes now, but really, I had to get, if I wanted to be happy, I had to accept that life presents tasks. Well, they say chop wood, carry water, chop wood. In Zen, I'm not really a Zen practitioner. Jack Kornfield wrote a book, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry, where he interviewed all these high-level meditation teachers, monastics and whatnot, lay people. And essentially, everybody acknowledged that while they've reached some level of heightened awareness, and you may even call it enlightenment by definition, the fact is they still had to do the laundry. Clothes still got dirty, still had to take a bath, still had to provide for yourself. You have to make money, whatever it is. The monks live a very austere life and they don't make money per se, but they still have to create an environment where the community is going to support them. The Buddha made it, when he created the monastic tradition, he made it so that the monastics would be dependent upon the villagers, the lay people, and they would then also hold the monks in esteem and they would provide for them. But it was a balance, and a monastic wasn't doing their job if they weren't relying upon the community.
In many ways, to me, that's really kind of what Buddhism is about. It's about balance.
Always.
Of everything. If for those of you who've seen some of my previous videos, Buddhism and Taoism are really kind of the traditions that led me to Omnism. As you all know, I studied a lot of every religion I possibly could, and I got into a lot of religions. But it wasn't until I really sank down into Buddhism that I came to the realization that all religions kind of had the same value, that all people had the same value, that all of us were really after the same thing, and that every single system of beliefs was really just a cultural filter, ultimately. And that if one religion worked well for one person, it might not work for another person. And that my opinion and my way of looking at anything wasn't necessarily of any value to anyone else, but it was certainly of value to me. And to me, that was kind of what the Buddha was saying. And so, with that thought, how do you feel about other religions, other systems of belief, being a Buddhist?
Well, one of the features of Buddhism is that the Buddha said, test it for yourself. I don't know that that's any other religious tradition suggests that you could reject their dogma or their practice. They sort of suggest that you must embrace it. Now, I was raised in the Judaic tradition, and I don't remember anybody saying it was optional. And it's certainly, I live in Texas, I live in the Bible Belt. Nobody has suggested that the practice of Christianity should be optional, what I've experienced. Now, I don't think the Buddha meant, well, go away, until you're ready.
Right.
His thing was, just do this middle path. It's not about materialism. It's not about suffering. It's about just living in the middle. So because at the time of the Buddha, the holy men tended to be ascetics. And ascetics ran around in the forest, their hair unkempt. They didn't shave. They didn't eat enough. They were scrawny. And they thought that suffering was a path to enlightenment. And the Buddha practiced that. He was very affluent, and then he became ascetic, and then he said, you know what? Neither way works. Let me show you the middle way, which that's the conclusion he came to, and he taught the Eightfold Noble Path, which was a wholesome lifestyle in every aspect, and it resided in being mindful all the time, being aware all the time of what you're doing. So I see it distinct from most other religions. Some people suggest that in the absence of God, we don't have morality. Okay? There's a lot of people that feel
we get to talk about that a lot on the show.
If you don't believe in God, you have no ability to be a moral person. I don't believe that. And I don't know what the Buddha himself would have said. I didn't talk to him. But I know that there is something that acts similar to God, and it's called karma. Do good, good happens. Do bad, bad happens. And your intent is everything. So there is something that kind of regulates the moral code, but really the reason we don't have God in Buddhism, it seems to me from my studies, is because the Buddha said that's not my deal. I'm not here to talk about God. I'm here to talk about happiness. What's going to make you happy? Being mindful, being aware, being wholesome, being of service. These are things which will bring about happiness and will relieve you from suffering, because suffering is the human condition. So you and I have both lived long enough that we've been in relationships that didn't succeed. We got our feelings hurt, and we hurt other people's feelings. But let's talk about getting our own feelings hurt. When we got our own feelings hurt, typically what humans will do is they will fault somebody. It's got to be somebody's fault. Somebody hurt me, not I got hurt. Somebody hurt me. A parent dies, or somebody close to us. I've been hurt by this loss. Instead of just seeing it as life. Suffering is life. And if you really want to grow, then just embrace suffering as much as you embrace joy, because it's all part of the deal. And that's why when the monk said to me, why don't people spend as much time trying to address their happiness, by that meaning, challenge their happiness, as they do challenging when they feel bad. So when we feel bad, then all of a sudden we want to reach out, we want to go to counseling, we want to drink or a drug, we want to do something to get out of it. And in Buddhism, you're really you're trying to achieve some neutrality.
Right.
If you're trying to achieve some neutrality, then being real high isn't any more beneficial than being low. Accept it to the extent that you're aware of it. So I'm feeling good, but this too shall pass. Everything passes, the Buddha said. Everything is impermanent. In my experience, absolutely right. Just as this body of mine is beginning to give way, everything I own has begun tear or break or deteriorate in some way, shape, or form. They tore down my favorite barbecue place in Chicago last year. I'm like, it's been there my whole life. But I'm able to get through it. But I got to tell you, a lot of people back in the neighborhood not dealing well with losing the barbecue joint. So, yeah, it all pivots around acceptance, and I see religion, while all religions seem to bring about a moral code, they don't all bring about an acceptance of the moment. And there's a lot of judgment, whereas Buddhism is about intent. So something happens, did I have bad intent? I could be doing good things, but if I don't have good intent, then it's not karmically going to benefit me. And I can do bad things, and and depending upon my intent, it's going to affect how severely my karma is going to be affected by it. If I run over a squirrel who darted out in front of my car, that's a bad karmic event, but it's mitigated by the fact that I had no intent to harm the squirrel.
Right.
But if I go out and shoot a squirrel because I think they're pests and they're chewing on the wires in my attic, that's a more serious karmic event that I'm not going to escape the karmic effects in that concept of karma so readily, right?
Something I've always kind of appreciated about Eastern thinking, and a place where I think Eastern thinking helped with me, was that in the West, we have this incredible tendency to think or consider the world to be broken. And part of that's just mythological. Part of it, I think, is just us as humans. That's the way we tend to think. The world is broken, and because it's broken, we need to make it right. We need to make it better. And not that I'm saying we shouldn't make it better, but the point being that we don't accept our own suffering. We don't accept the world as it is. We look at it as something that was destroyed and somehow needs to go back to this perfection, which probably never existed. Even in modern politics, we find that kind of thinking. Or everything was great in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, or everything was great many, many years ago, and it's not great now. And something I appreciated about Eastern thinking is that it had more of a tendency, particularly in Buddhism, to say, this is life. If we accept the way it is, then we don't suffer in the same way. I used to perform a kind of meditation, or it was a guided meditation, where I would experience my own mortality, experience myself decomposing. What is the term for that? I can't remember the term for it, but you actually imagine yourself dying and decomposing and becoming dust. And in accepting that, we accept life.
Right, and in our Western society, at least in the U.S., I haven't really lived abroad. I see a lot of aversion to aging. That's real.
Yes,
Just as I see aversion to discomfort. So people don't want to be uncomfortable, especially if they can afford not to be uncomfortable. Then they really go kind of hog wild. But I don't know that cosmetic surgeons would thrive as well as they do in Asia, as they do here. Because a line in the face is a natural progression. It happens. Your skin begins to lose its elasticity. Things begin to happen. Your muscles are not as responsive. They just don't have the same capacity. Well, we have people taking HGH and testosterone at the gym. We have people going and getting faces lifted, eyes fixed, all kinds of things. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying that propensity is primarily indicative of the fact that we just cannot accept the natural progression of our lives. So why are we such a chemically dependent society in the U.S.? Because people don't want to suffer. So rather than suffer, at least that's my deal. I wasn't going to suffer. Why suffer when I can go get high? Why suffer when I could do some cocaine? Or why suffer if I could drink?
Right.
The fact that it didn't get me through the suffering, it only ameliorated it for a short period of time. It took me a while to figure out, this isn't working. I can't stay stoned 24 hours a day. So I have to face the reality. And that's when I finally came around. But up until then, I was giving it a sure run at not being uncomfortable by medicating or buying my way out of problems. And I had a lot of money at that point.
And money didn't do it either, did it? I
No,
mean, money
no.
doesn't take care of pain at all.
No, and it probably helped that I lost all that money. I went from being rich to being poor, millions of dollars gone. And that's probably, in the long run, it's good. I'm not so enthused about it as I get older and I start thinking about being in some sort of nursing home where I'm going to be overlooked and abandoned. But it was good in terms of pushing me into looking at the way things really are. Lama Marut used to say in his lectures, if you are born into the United States in this time, you have good karma, because 2/3 of the world today is going to struggle for enough rice and water to survive. So while 2/3 of the world has to spend the day simply working on survival, here we are with an opportunity to work on our spiritual wellness. Are we going to squander that? He used to say, if you're looking for the right waterproof iPod cover so you can listen to your iPod in the shower, he said, you're missing out. And I get it.
Yeah.
Changing cars, whatever it is, all the things that I could do because I was affluent enough to do it. And everybody's doing it at their own level, whether in the United States at least.
Well, and yet I think that also brings up an interesting point of how suffering is relative. And to me, that's a very powerful point behind Buddhism, is that in this country, no matter how rich we are, no matter the fact that we don't have problem getting food. I mean, most Americans never miss a meal. We are not dealing with the kind of pain that exists in other areas of the world, and yet we're still in pain. Pain is and suffering are so much a part of our lives, regardless of how much money we have, regardless of the way our standard of living is, that it's irrelevant. And Buddhism says that doesn't matter. I mean, Buddhism,
and the Buddha knew this because when he was born into great affluence.
Right.
And he found as he matured into an adult that he was unhappy. And so he went out in search. So he knew that affluence wasn't, and according to the legend of the Buddha,
right,
he really escaped a lot of the suffering that a normal person would be supposed to, because his father made it a point to protect him from uncomfortable things,
including old people. He didn't even.
Right, yes. He wasn't exposed to old people, sick people, dying people, or ascetics.
Right.
And so when he was exposed suddenly to that in one day, it was transformational for him. He's like, well, wait, and then he tried to figure out, well, what is happiness? And he couldn't get his finger on it because we didn't know. And historically, in Hinduism or any of the other religions, happiness is not a goal. Salvation is the goal, right?
Right.
Yeah, and he's like,
which is similar to what we face in the West, is that sort of psychology.
Well, in Buddhism, salvation is being in the moment. Acting karmically appropriate. So, we don't sell human flesh. We don't prostitute people. We don't do things that are just negative. And we all know inherently, if we pay attention to what we're doing that's negative. And the loving kindness that we practice, and I know you practice loving kindness, metta as they call it in this tradition of Buddhism, Theravada tradition. Metta, if you practice loving kindness, after a while you begin to almost be embarrassed by your hostile thoughts, your animosity, like, oh, that's not really loving kindness at all, is it? So you begin to hear because you're mindful, because you've trained yourself to be aware, and so you begin to act like a better person. You begin to behave your way into being a better person until it becomes somewhat automatic, to the extent that Ken's capable of being kind automatically.
And all of us, yes. Something else that we've talked about before, because I find it interesting, a lot of what we talk about on this show is how many of the problems that humans have don't stem from belief systems themselves, but they stem from the way that humans just behave, part of our just natural psychology. And regardless of the fact that Buddhism is incredibly enlightened, I can't imagine any religion more than, say, Buddhism or Taoism that should understand the way things work, on a primal level. You will still get traditional dogmatism in Buddhism. I know we've talked about how you might go to another school and they would say, well, if you don't sit like this, you're not going to reach as high a level of enlightenment, which sounds absurd in Buddhism, but it still exists just because humans tend to be that way. We latch on to our traditions and they become dogma.
Absolutely. You know, people ask the question all the time. Is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy? You know, it depends upon who you're asking.
Right. Right.
It certainly is a philosophy. Is it a religion? Yes, because it's got practices and traditions that people adhere to. But Buddhism only exists because we created it. Buddha didn't declare himself to be in charge of the new religion any more than Christ declared himself to be Christian. You know, the best that I understand, I've studied Christianity, is Jesus died a Jew. He may have been lamenting he was a Jew at the time for a variety of reasons, but he didn't. He's not the one that wrote the scripture and said, "Hey, you know, this is it. You have to accept. You know, we're going to call the new thing Christianity." Any more than Buddha said, "We're going to call this new thing Buddhism." But he knew that there would be a practice. He knew that there were going to be teachings, and as a result, the monks, you know, people followed Jesus. I have no qualms with that. Jesus taught for 3 years, and we had no formal methodology of recording his teachings at the time. His teachings were recorded subsequent. Well, at the time of the Buddha, who taught for 40 ongoing years, the monks, different groups of monks, were responsible for memorizing word for word some of the teachings, and they chanted them every day for the next 500 years until they were transcribed into Pali, and then they were translated into other languages. So there's a very rigid methodology that was available 2,600 years ago for what is now Buddhism. And so we do have an understanding, just as I said before. It's atheistic, but it's atheistic. Nobody's told me I can't believe in God. I've never had other Buddhists tell me that. But when Buddha was asked, well, what about God? The short answer is, what are you asking me for? You know, I'm teaching happiness.
Well, you know,
and happiness is an inside job. So move along. Next question, right?
Well, I always have found it interesting that ultimately Siddhartha and Jesus Christ, or Yeshua, whatever you want to call him, they sort of performed the exact same function. They were coming into systems, Siddhartha into Hinduism, Jesus Christ into Judaism, systems that had become incredibly structuralized, had become very dogmatic and very negative in it, at least to a certain extent.
They were certainly rigid.
They were certainly rigid, and they came in and they both sort of said, "Okay, look, we need to come back to the middle. We've become Jesus Christ said we've become entirely too legalistic. We need to get back to the principle." And to me, that was really what Siddhartha was saying as well.
Well, Siddhartha, you know, it was very controversial because, well, Siddhartha wasn't controversial. Once he sat down under the tree, the Bodhi tree, when he got up, he was no longer referred to as Siddhartha. He was referred to as Tathagata, or the Buddha, the awakened one. Right. And he made that distinction, by the way. He said, "I'm not Siddhartha anymore." But what he did was he started allowing people to become monastics who weren't born into the monastic tradition in India, which was pretty controversial. He ultimately accepted women, which was even more controversial. A lot of things he was doing was shaking up the structure that had existed before him, although he didn't declare that's what he was doing. He just said, "This is the way." Right. He didn't say, "I'm a revolutionary." He just said, you know, if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, here's the path.
And I don't think I can imagine anything better to end on, because really that's what it is. It's the path. Ken, I can't tell you how much I've appreciated this. I rarely get down here to Dallas anymore, but I finally got to see Ken again, and we actually got to have a real conversation and got to do this interview. And this has been really important to me. I apologize if we run on a little long. I know this is much longer than my normal programs, but I think we got to talk about some really important things. So
Power to the people.
that's right. Ken, I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And guys, I'm the Urban Omnist. I'll see you on the next one.